There are few franchises in the JRPG genre that have seen such an uptick in popularity in the West in recent years than Persona. Over the last decade or so, the Shin Megami Tensei spin-off has gone from niche JRPG played by only a few outside of Japan to one of the most popular properties in the genre, outside of huge players like Final Fantasy. Moreover, while the fan base is often seen as divided, a burgeoning surge in the popularity can also be seen in the franchise that birthed Persona, the much less newcomer-friendly and arguably more mechanics-driven Shin Megami Tensei series, with both the 4th and 5th entry seeing much greater success in the West than previous titles, and even a remaster of SMT3 making its way to Western shelves in recent months. But such success is not one that has only affected Shin Megami Tensei and Persona. While they have in many ways contributed to a new wave of popularity for the JRPG in the West, such a wave of interest has fueled new localizations for older releases and more of a worldwide focus for titles that perhaps we might not have seen in the West a decade ago. The Caligula Effect 1 and 2, the Atelier series, the Blue Reflection series, and many others have all found new fans outside of Japan, thanks in no small part to a resurgence in Western JRPG fans. Now, I'm not saying that the JRPG hasn't always had its fans outside of Japan, because as a lifelong fan of the genre, I'm living proof that it has. But its place in popular gaming seemed to fade a little in the PS3 and 360 era, with the explosion of Call of Duty and other blockbuster cinematic games eclipsing it for a while. But 2021 was very kind to JRPG fans, with more amazing new titles in the genre seemingly dropping every month, and an overall haul of games that made us all hope it would continue into 2022. Hoping to continue that trend is the game we're talking about today, the enigmatic and quietly anticipated Monarch. But before we get into things proper, there's a few things we need to go over. Firstly, I was provided a review code for Monarch by the game's Western publisher, NIS America. So thanks a lot to those guys for hooking me up. Obviously, this is not a sponsored video because, I mean, who would sponsor my content? But I wanted to be transparent about the fact that I didn't pay for this game, even if that has no bearing on my opinion of it. Now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about Monarch. Monarch was developed by Japanese developer Lancas. Lancas. I'm going to say Lancas. And was released in Japan at the end of last year. Pitched as a dark and mysterious JRPG, the artwork and trailers would in many ways evoke memories of the aforementioned Shin Megami Tensei series, a fact that was only compounded when Lancas announced that several ex-SMT devs had worked on it. However, eagle-eyed viewers also could see a little Persona in the mix too, with what appeared to be clearly a school setting, a large array of teenage student characters, and multiple choice questions and answers being asked of the player to dictate how they were viewed by others. So, the question arises, is this the perfect middle ground? Does Monarch have the great characters and social elements of Persona and the more hardcore mechanics-driven combat of SMT all rolled into one? Nope. So, stop me if you've heard this one before. Monarch takes place in a Japanese school. The protagonist is a teenage boy who has no spoken dialogue and generally only speaks in responses that the player chooses. More on those in a bit, by the way. The school itself, sometime in the last few weeks, has developed a barrier around it, trapping all those inside. As if this wasn't bad enough, the floors of all buildings that comprise the school are now host to a mysterious mist that send any who remain in it mad. Now, I know some of these elements might already be familiar to you. I know they were to me, but then we discover the sucker punch. The main protagonist also has amnesia, because of course he does. Like, as an aside, I understand why this was originally used as a storytelling device in the JRPG genre. After all, it allows the protagonist, just like the player, to be completely ignorant of the world created, whilst also being inexplicably tied to it in important ways that can be revealed later in the story. But at the same time, the use of this trope is so rife at this point, it's basically a meme. There's got to be a better way to do it. Anyways, after learning that the mist is tied to a mysterious separate dimension simply named the Otherworld, which is accessible through mobile phones, our protagonist and an ever-expanding group of companions decide to try and rid the school of the mist and those responsible by forming a group named the New Student Council. As I'm sure many of you have already clocked, This premise is extremely derivative of both Persona 4 and Persona 5, with the Phantom Thieves also looking to rid places like their school of supernatural forces that were tied to the personalities of those who attend or work there, and the group in Persona 4 accessing a secret otherworld through a TV instead of a mobile phone via the Midnight Channel. There's even an Igor-esque character who enigmatically appears throughout the game to discuss things with the protagonist. However, despite this, to say that Monarch shows no originality in its narrative would be unfair. Throughout the game, you're often asked genuine psych-evaluation questions, which help determine your stats, and also how a few other characters interact with you. This ties interestingly to the game's combat and progression systems, more on those in a bit, but also unfortunately comes with its own set of other issues. Firstly, I've literally lost count of how many times the game stops to offer me a single dialogue option. At first, I thought this might be to do with my character profile, or might be a clever commentary on the inescapable nature of fate or something. But as the game went on, it became clearer and clearer that this wasn't the case. It seems that this is just an underbaked attempt to implement a cause and effect system to proceedings, or to make sure the player is still paying attention. The byproduct of this was just a whole lot of pointless one-response answers, serving to only increase levels of boredom rather than levels of interest. Also, speaking of these conversations, there are a lot of them, and they often are far too long. One thing that many newer JRPGs lack, in my opinion, is brevity. The ability to succinctly deliver great dialogue and a great story without over-explaining or re-explaining everything to death. Squaresoft were masters of this in the mid to late 1990s. Now, don't get me wrong, I love dialogue-driven games, and I'm more than willing to read as much as is needed. I mean, I recently finished playing Xenogears, and for God's sake, that game has hundreds of thousands of lines of dialogue. But the difference is, it's all relevant dialogue, and in no way feels bloated or unnecessary. Now, you could argue that Xenogears is a bloated game, but that criticism would have to be aimed at its ambitious thematic undertaking, not its literal dialogue. My point is that there are many instances of great JRPGs with more dialogue than Monarch that tell a much more complex story on grander scales, but because the dialogue in those games is so razor-focused, you don't even notice. In short, the pacing is better. Monarch feels long, drawn out, and bloated for much of its playtime, and as you spend hour after hour talking over and over again about the same points, or reaffirming the same themes, or listening to another exposition dump, boredom soon sets in. It's such a shame too, because there are interesting themes underneath all of this, and some great ideas present, but they are almost all executed in a way that serves to make them so boring that by the end of the game's first chapter, you're considering skipping large chunks of the dialogue. All of this is not helped by Monarch's presentation. Now, I know how it is. I used to make games for a living, and during that time, I worked on projects of all sizes, from massive AAA franchises to tiny little indies. Not all games have the Persona or the Shin Megami Tensei budget, and it's clear that Monarch didn't. However, even taking that into account, the visuals and animations on display here are very antiquated, feeling more like they belong in a game from the end of the PS2/early PS3 era than a new release on PS4, PC and Switch in 2022. Character designs are generic, animations are stiff or substituted with a black screen cutaway, and environments are very, very drab, with repeated assets and whole areas copy and pasted. While there are some disturbing visuals here and there, they're unfortunately few and far between, serving as an occasional surprise instead of a common element. On top of this, the game's UI is also pretty basic, and while functional, the black and white display only serves to keep things looking even more dull. The sound and soundtrack fares better, although it's once again a mixed bag. I've been playing in Japanese for my playthrough, and the voice actors all did a great job, barring one or two slightly annoying tropey characters, who I can only imagine probably would have been even more annoying in English. However, the real confusing part comes with the game's score. In certain sections, the game's use of a primarily horror-inspired soundtrack is actually really effective, with great use of strings and orchestral elements that compound the atmosphere. However, when entering a battle or boss fight, the music will often shift to a jarring rock track that, while in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, really creates a tonal whiplash for the player. Okay, so we've talked about the premise, the story, and the presentation, so let's talk about the last and arguably most important element for many, the gameplay. So first of all, it has to be said that Monarch has a pretty decent combat and leveling system. Battles are turn-based and take place in large areas with multiple foes and team members on either side. On a character's turn, they're able to move around the battlefield within a certain movement range, denoted by a circle on the ground. They are then able to attack, buff, debuff, use abilities and items, etc. within the range of another circle that varies in size depending on the type of attack, the weapon being used, or the character in question. Moreover, if you're within a certain range of another friendly character, they will also attack the foe in question, allowing for big potential damage. However, such a feature is also shared by the enemy, meaning that they can make quick work of you if your positioning is bad. Add to this several environmental elements and other factors like back attacks causing more damage and stopping counters, and you're left with a really solid and original battle system here. On top of all of this, there's also the Madness and Awakening meters, which can be utilized to both power up or lose control of a character. This Madness mechanic is also a factor outside of battle, with any time being spent in the mist or around certain enemies or certain situations driving up a Madness percentage meter for each of your team members. Maxing this out can lead to a game over, so you must either leave the mist and visit the doctor or take a suppressant medication to lower the percentage as needed. On top of this is the game's progression system, which for me at least is probably its best feature. Essentially, after a battle or when searching mist-covered areas, you will accrue spirit points. These are a currency that is used to learn new skills on each player's skill tree. Each skill is unlocked with a different points value, with some costing as little as only 5 to 10 spirit points and others costing thousands. Every time a new skill is unlocked on a character's skill tree, they will gain a level, regardless of how many spirit points it cost, meaning they will see an increase to all of their stats, regardless if you buy a cheap skill or a more expensive one. However, the rub here is that all characters share the same pool of spirit points, and these points are also used to buy items needed for battle. Moreover, for a very large chunk of the game, there is no opportunity to farm spirit points. They're only accrued through some exploration and battles determined by the story. This means that the player needs to think very carefully about who to level up, what items to buy, and when to spend or not spend spirit points. Also, it's worth noting that the combat in this game can be very challenging. Maybe not SMT levels hard, but still more than a little tough in places. So while all of this doesn't add up to a combat and leveling experience on the level of maybe other classics in the genre, it nonetheless stands as by far the most interesting element in Monarch's playbook. I know it sounds like I'm being overtly negative on Monarch, and for what it's worth, I really hope there are people out there who see more value in it than I have. I don't hate it, it's a competent JRPG, but in a world where we had Shin Megami Tensei 5, Tales of Arise, Nier Replicant, Monster Hunter Stories 2, Bravely Default 2, and many, many more in just the last 12 months, there's little room for just competent in my back catalogue. If you like Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, or both, then there might be something here for you, but I would at the very least wait for a sale. For me, there are far too many better examples of the genre, both new and old, that I have yet to play to recommend Monarch to you. Thanks for watching, guys. Let me know in the comments if you're planning on picking up Monarch, or what you think of it if you do. I'll be in the comments to talk with all of you about it. Also, if you like this video or saw any value in it, then maybe give it a like, sub to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss a video. Also, please share if you can. It all helps the channel grow. Thanks again for watching. Stay safe out there.